Okay, I'd like to start with a quick question. How many of you were born in a rural area? Okay, I saw some hands go up immediately, and some other people I can see are still thinking about it. If someone asked me that question, I'm not actually sure I could answer. And the reason that I've asked you this is because the biggest problem we had in the rural areas chapter to begin with was, well, what actually is a rural area? Because it varies from country to country, it varies over time. And basically, most of the definitions that we have are looking at rural in terms of what is not urban. And that's not necessarily a particularly satisfactory way of defining something, but we didn't find anything better. So rural areas is basically counts for everything that's not urban, but there are problems with that. How do we decide if we're leaving Cape Town, either heading north on the N1 or east on the N2? At what point do we suddenly decide, okay, now we're leaving an urban area, now we're entering a rural area? There's no kind of set line for that. There's the kind of transition zone. And when we're assessing the literature for IPCC, we need to determine how we're going to include various aspects, either in the urban areas chapter or the rural areas chapter. So even deciding what literature we had to assess was a bit of a challenge for us from the start. But globally speaking, rural areas are quite important because over 50% of the world's population still lives in rural areas. There are countries that have peaked their rural population, and there are others that are approaching the peak of rural population. But globally speaking, over half of the world is still rural. And of course, in developing countries, it's still a higher figure than that, despite the context for urbanization. So in terms of a spatial area of concern, rural areas are quite important. Just to pull out some of the key findings from the rural areas chapter, the major impacts of climate change on rural areas will firstly be on water availability. And if we look at rural areas in an African context, the water availability is going to decrease. Again, that's something that's already well known in this part of the world. And of course, if the water availability decreases, that will have implications for all natural resource-based livelihoods, which is what tends to predominate in rural areas. Not just agriculture, that's what we tend to think of first of all, and that is obviously a very important one, but also livelihoods that are dependent on forestry and on fisheries. Food production, overall, the prospects for food production under climate change are not particularly good. There's a whole chapter, a thematic chapter on food production in the report, but we were looking purely from, obviously, a rural perspective. So we looked at staple food crops, at beverage crops, and at high-value crops. And for those of us that like our cup or more than one cup of coffee a day, I'm sure you've seen there's been a lot of press recently about the impacts of climate change on coffee production. Particularly in Brazil, which is a major producer of coffee, there'll be a decline in coffee production there, with the amount of the decline contingent on how high the change in temperature is. And even if we can adapt successfully, even if some areas which were formerly not coffee-growing areas but become suitable for coffee and coffee is grown there, even if that occurs, there'll still be an overall decline, so that will obviously affect the prices and the availability. Another impact that came out, particularly in the rural areas, was the impact of climate change on rural-based tourism, which can include coastal tourism, natural resource-based tourism, and ecotourism, which, of course, within the global tourism industry is growing. And also winter sports-based tourism. I was lucky enough to be in the Arctic 2 weeks ago, and temperatures there at this time of year are usually minus 20 degrees, and a couple of weeks ago they were fluctuating around 0, so that's a pretty substantial difference from the norm. And whilst people were saying they would expect there to be at least half a metre of snow on the ground, in some places there was no snow at all, and obviously that has implications for winter-based sports. Another thing which came out in the rural areas chapter, well, and I'm sure in a lot of the other chapters as well, was, of course, that climate change, the issue of attribution of different changes solely to climate change. There are complex causal chains in the way that climate change will affect ecosystems and livelihoods in rural areas, because rural areas are already experiencing a number of other stresses, among them environmental degradation, the effects of changing land and natural resources policies, and the effect of many years of underinvestment in farming, which is changing in some contexts, not all. But these are all stresses which are affecting rural areas, and then climate change is going to interact with those to create a new context of risks. I won't talk too much about the impact of climate change on migration, because I'm sure Colleen might mention that from a human security perspective. But again, that's one. Climate change is likely to have an effect on migration, but of course it's not the only factor that's going to play a role in migration. And it's very difficult to say how much change in migration flows and the destinations of migrants will change as a result of climate change at the moment. One other interesting finding, well, I think is interesting from the rural areas perspective, is that a lot of climate policies will actually have implications for rural areas, not always in a positive way. So, for example, biofuels. This is something which has gone rather quiet in the press recently, but certainly was very publicized within the last couple of years. Obviously, biofuels, jatropha, and the other crops that are grown for biofuels are grown in rural areas. There was a lot of press around the potential effects on food security. But if a government were to choose to promote biofuels as an alternative to traditional carbon-based fuels, is that a good thing or not for the people in rural areas? Well, there are benefits, but there can also be disadvantages around food production, around stresses on food security, and around land ownership. Climate change, how do we know who will be affected by climate change in rural areas? What's the nature of vulnerability? Well, a couple of different factors came up as playing a role here. Things like farm size will affect the extent to which farmers are vulnerable to climate change. The level of integration within the market. We have obviously a huge range of natural resource-based livelihoods. Some are very integrated into the market, some are not. Access to land, access to governance, and on a very individual level, gender also plays a role in who will be most affected in rural areas by climate change. But it's not all negative. There's a lot of evidence that adaptation is occurring within natural resource-based livelihoods, so particularly around agriculture, around forestry, also around biodiversity. There's a lot of ecosystem-based adaptation. Not so much in fisheries at the moment, but still some steps in the right direction. More so at the moment in developed country rural areas than developing rural areas, but an emerging body of evidence, basically,